Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's news largely circles vaccines, whether that is revising the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine, whether or not the influenza vaccine is effective and how it might be related to the CCP virus, that there might be a possible oral vaccine for the CCP virus as well. There's also other news on various supplements. Let's begin with the first and most immediate. Changes to the trial results for the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine. It was largely considered somewhere around 95% effective. This is great. The problem is that's based on data that wasn't necessarily up to date. When they went and re-evaluated their studies, they found that there was a slightly better improvement. Rather than 76% effective at protecting against asymptomatic cases of the CCP virus, it was in fact 79%. This data comes from looking at 32,000 people involved in the clinical trial. It's also substantially better at protecting people who are over 65 years old. It's 85% in that case. It's also nearly 100% effective at preventing severe cases. This means that the worst that's going to occur is roughly 21% of individuals may experience mild symptoms. This is not so different to the annual influenza vaccine. While on the topic of the influenza vaccine, there appears to be a relationship between the influenza vaccine and a certain resistance to the CCP virus. As a general rule, you could say that influenza and the CCP virus are distant cousins. They're both a coronavirus. They are substantially different in how they infect people, some of the symptoms, and the mechanisms by which they achieve these results. Despite this, you might still expect to see some relationship between them. We've seen this particularly with young people and adults who've been exposed to certain strains of influenza in the last few years who had more resistance to the CCP virus. This is why research coming out of Michigan is interesting. They looked at 27,000 patients who had received CCP virus tests. They also examined who had received the influenza vaccine. They found a slight but significant decrease in the positive test rate for those who had received the vaccine. The difference isn't huge overall when you're looking at it. It's 4% of those who had the vaccine tested positive for the CCP virus versus 4.9% of those who had not received the vaccine. That's a roughly 20% difference between the two groups, a statistically important distinction. The nature of the immune system means that there might be enough flexibility in it from the influenza shots that were received to be able to handle some of the CCP virus. On the other side of the coin, it could also be an unexpected and rather unexplainable result, some sort of confounding variable. No matter how you look at it, vaccines are going to be necessary to deal with both the CCP virus as it stands and long-term with other diseases like influenza. At least with America, they've passed one significant milestone. That is that they are giving out more than 6 million doses of vaccines every 2 days or thereabouts. They're currently able to distribute 3 million doses every day, or at least for the last 2 days in a row. This is a huge thing. At least in theory, based on that alone, it would take roughly 110 days to give every American every dose of the vaccine that they currently need. That's going to help America getting on top of the over 500,000 deaths that have occurred due to the CCP virus. Before they can get to vaccinating everyone, they're already making exceptionally good headway. Nearly a quarter of the population has received at least their first dose of the vaccine, and nearly 14% have received both of the vaccine doses or the one dose they require to be fully covered. Nearly 70% of those over 65 have received a dose, and they are continuing on their way. Part of this owes to the fact that the American government has been able to approve multiple vaccines. There are the 2-dose vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, and there is also a single-dose vaccine from Johnson & Johnson. This means that the American government is able to source and then distribute a number of vaccines to areas that it might be more difficult or less difficult to supply based on the current limitations. They're also able to order in more vaccines from different sources, which means that even if they're struggling to get supplies from one place, they can get them from another. This may be further reinforced by the current trials of an oral vaccine for the CCP virus. One of the challenges in oral vaccines is that they often get denatured by the acids in the stomach. This somewhat prevents the human body from being able to rally the immune system and respond to the training from the vaccine. There are only a few vaccines that are administered orally for this reason. They're also quite hard to develop. The nature of and funding available for CCP virus vaccine research has made it possible to develop this, and a lot of information is contained in the press release that's been released this week. Unlike the injected vaccines that we currently have available, Oravax, which is the oral vaccine for the CCP virus, has certain strengths. Some of these advantages include the fact that it is transported in a relatively standard refrigerator, that it can be stored at room temperature. This means if you have to move the vaccine from one place to another, it's a lot easier. The fact it can be taken orally means that you don't require any special skill sets or knowledge to administer it. That means that if you're sending it to somewhere isolated or difficult to reach, you don't have to worry about many of the difficulties associated with an injectable vaccine. So far, they're relying on animal study results to be able to move on to stage 1 human clinical trials. Unlike some of the previous clinical trials, many of which failed, this has the advantage of being a second-generation vaccine. That is, they've already proven all the concepts that are likely to be applied. They just have to make them work with an oral vaccine. This could be something like a pill swallowed or a nasal spray. Going from news about the CCP virus and vaccines, we can now talk about reproduction, particularly how sperm pass on genetic code that isn't DNA coded. Most people who are somewhat familiar with biology understand that sperm contain half of your genome, or half of your chromosomes more particularly, that they match with the ovum, and this creates the full 46 required for a developing and functioning human. This is DNA based though. The DNA does not carry RNA or the epigenetic changes that we're familiar with that occur in an adult, or at least that was the long-running understanding. In recent years, we've established a body of evidence indicating that, in fact, sperm can carry epigenetic changes, that these can control certain genes and how they express themselves in offspring. The distinction from normal genetics and epigenetics is that these changes are on top of the genome, which means they modify the gene without changing the gene code. Think of it as like an on-off switch, or a suppressor and promoter function. Is the gene going to be more or less functional based on behavior of the parents? This is kind of important when you look at some of the unhealthy and healthy lifestyles being engaged in today. Is long-term obesity, or someone who's extremely healthy, going to impart these changes to their children via sperm? The research in this case modified the diet of the male mice in such a way that it would affect the histone spooling. The histones are proteins around which DNA is wound. This allows for it to be tightly packed. By having the male mice have a folate deficient diet, they were able to establish that this was then passed on as a heritable defect to their offspring. This could, in theory, in the case of an adult, have an effect on birth defects. That is in fact what they found. The offspring of these male mice that had a folate deficient diet and epigenetic changes demonstrated some of these changes. If you are thinking of trying to be healthy and you're aware of some of the benefits this might bring your body, you might also think of using supplements, particularly weight loss supplements. You may wish to carefully check just which ones you are using though. According to a new study that's come out very recently, several of these weight loss supplements contain questionable and banned supplements that aren't meant to be within them. One of them was a nasal inhaler, and this was found to contain fenpromethine. This is a kind of stimulant. Stimulants aren't necessarily bad, after all, caffeine is such, but you don't want to be using it since it can be quite bad for you. It would explain how the weight loss supplement does work though. Among other things, your brain uses some of the most energy in your body. This, in conjunction with stimulating the various muscles, allowing you to work out more aggressively, you would be burning more energy. But you'd also be taking a supplement that is banned by the World Doping Agency. There's issues with it as far as the FDA goes. And many supplements, if they don't contain this particular example, contain others. In fact, the study identified 8 other stimulants that were not allowed to be used. That's a pretty big problem. Imagine if you took 9 stimulants at the same time. How many ways could that start playing havoc with your mind and body? And that's exactly what they've found in some cases. Up to 9 different stimulants. They commonly found 4 in at least one supplement. Again, 1 is a problem. 2 is a problem. Once you start getting beyond this point, you get a lot of chemical interactions and effects on your body that can often be counterintuitive and counterproductive. This gets worse though. A lot of the stimulants they've been using aren't listed as an ingredient. That's a big problem. Like with many supplements, depending on what country you're in and how the supplement is labeled, they may not have to list everything. For example, if it's below a certain threshold, they may not need to tell you it's there because the concentration's arguably not high enough. In other cases, because it's not the active ingredient that they're trying to sell, so to speak, they don't need to list it at all. It's simply an unintended addition. This is one of the reasons why supplements can often be a big problem. How they're regulated is very different to how normal, efficacious drugs are regulated. Medication that's available as a prescription is often tested more aggressively and more rigorously regulated than supplements are in just about every country. Recent investigations into supplements overall have been looking for a variety of different drugs that could have been in it. Drugs is used here in lieu of supplements as the effect they have is far stronger than what your standard supplement should have, and as mentioned, they're often regulated drugs that should not be present. The reason that at least some of these should not be present is that they can cause cardiac arrest and death. The FDA has issued warnings about some of these supplements in the past. The problem is that once the FDA issues the warning, those particular supplements are then replaced with new ones that have either closely related or different drugs in them that have the same effect. And this makes it hard, and in many cases impossible, to accurately know what you are actually going to be consuming in many of these supplements. Quite a few of them, as we've mentioned, can be prohibited. Some have never been approved for use, some of them were approved for use as a prescription drug, and some of them were approved and then later withdrawn. The final piece of news we have for you is perhaps somewhat suitable for the internet. It's the development of an AI that exists for the sole purpose of arguing. If you ever want to argue with strangers, the internet is a place for it. And this AI may at least remove the need for another human to be the one you're arguing with. IBM is the one that's developing this particular AI program, and it's intended to debate against humans. Over a year ago, this particular AI was already able to form complex arguments in response to a topic it was given. In 2019, this was whether or not preschool should be subsidized for families. The AI was able to present a case in support of this argument and base it on evidence, rationale, and logical reasoning. That's sort of scary. AI's ability to process vast amounts of information drastically outweighs that of a human. It's almost impossible for a human to both access, analyze, process, and then churn out an argument at the same speed at which an AI can do this. The weakness for an AI has always been its ability to link together the various facts in a logical and communicatable manner. This is now no longer the case. Despite how far away it is to yet occurring, the AI was described as scoring highly and that its debating ability was decent. Considering that not that long ago, simple chatbots were incredibly rudimentary and limited, what they're capable of now is very much where the AI for a debate is. In the next few years, we're likely to see a significant growth in it. There are a large number of laboratories and companies working on debating robots like this. The limitations going forward is that, for the most part, computer researchers have never really looked at the need for an AI to be able to do the holistic things required in debating. This being cognition, knowledge, communication, and the ability to pass the content. All of this has been dealt with separately, but never as a single event and process. Soon we won't be losing arguments to strangers on the internet, we'll be losing them to an AI on the internet. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.